Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming back. It is Business Monday. Cold, rainy outside, hot inside. The money man, Gary Sasse, is back in town. We've got him. You get to listen to him. Gary Sasse, welcome back.
Thank you.
Big things going on across the world, across the country, and in Rhody. Let's talk opportunity zones. Opportunity zones came out of President Trump's tax package. It is designed to identify low-income areas in distress and give investors significant tax benefits on capital gains and a bunch of other facets to be able to make it worthwhile for them to invest in these. The proposition has been how it's being applied has come under attack by both ProPublica and investigative reporting in the New York Times. What's your take on opportunity zones?
Let me tell you a little bit about the backstory. There would not have been opportunity zones in the Tax Cut and Jobs Act if it wasn't for Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina. They needed his vote, and he felt strongly that opportunity zones were important and played a key role.
And Tim Scott from South Carolina is a Republican and one of the few African Americans in the United States Senate.
Right, and so we would not have had opportunity zones if it wasn't for his leadership and his insistence, and the president, dealt with him. The other thing is this concept's not new. Go back to Jack Kemp.
Yeah.
In the 1970s, Reagan. They called them different things, but they essentially were opportunity zones.
Enterprise zones and other.
Enterprise zones were a little bit different because they're much more narrow. So is an opportunity zone a good idea or a bad idea? And the answer to the question, it depends on how, where, and when it's used. But out of full disclosure, if an opportunity zone is going to be effective and help rebuild a neighborhood or a city or an economy, the people that benefit from the opportunity zones in part don't have the capital to invest.
Right.
So the capital would come from upper income people, from corporations, from developers who have the resources, and you're giving them very preferential tax treatment for doing that. And so to sit around and think that somehow opportunity zone investment, springs from the soil in the community is absolutely naive.
Yeah, that's not the way it's happening.
And it's the way metaphysically impossible, because if it wasn't an opportunity zone, the resources would be there. So it really depends on how it's used. And Pawtucket's a special case. Now let me say this about Pawtucket: no one has seen the final proposal and what the deal looks like. So we're talking about concepts right now, but we know a couple of things, and I think Pawtucket is a poster child for why the opportunity zone legislation can be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
For 70 years, at least 70 years, Pawtucket's been stagnating. You go downtown, you go to various neighborhoods, and this gives Pawtucket, it provides the wherewithal for major development in a city that for decades, as I said, has been stagnating. So if you can...
Stagnating might be a kind word.
Well, it's
declining.
It's been declining. And not Pawtucket's fault. Manufacturing base has declined. Downtown commercialism or retail is declined. So there are a lot of reasons for the decline. Nothing that the city of Pawtucket necessarily did or didn't do. And so opportunity zones come along. In this case, if you can use an opportunity zone, effectively investing about 70 to 90 million from public money in it, and generate $400 million worth of development, and that $400 million includes 200 housing units, includes a hotel with 200 rooms, and includes a soccer stadium of 7,500 people for about $45 million, another 200,000 square feet of commercial office space, developed in a strategic location.
Mm-hmm.
It's not in the middle of Kansas on a plain somewhere. It's,
Sure.
It's on a historic waterway. And you pull that off, and you use the opportunity zones to encourage investments. The facts are that the people that took some of the risk get a very big reward. Basically, they are forgiven their capital gains tax deferred. If they hold the asset for 10 years, their capital gains tax are waived. They can trade between projects on how to use their capital gains. So they're getting a lot, but they're also giving a lot. But the question is quality. If you build opportunity zones like we did with some of our enterprise zones, and nothing really happens, then it's just, well, capitalism, corporate welfare.
Right.
Now, how do you control for it? So there's a legitimate question. Is the project good? Is it well managed? Does it have a major impact? And there are 8,700 opportunity zones based on census data in the country. Also,
25 in Rhode Island.
right. Basically, the Secretary of the Treasury has waived the requirements for low income and has granted opportunity zone status to places in Nevada and I think elsewhere.
There's been a lot of questions about some of them. The governor of West Virginia, who owns the big development hotel down there that I think Congress escapes to if there's a nuclear war or something, he owns that, and by God, happenstance, the governor of West Virginia, one of the most wealthy men in the state, his hotel is in an opportunity zone.
Right. So, as I said, it's how it's done. It clearly is a trickle-down economic theory, but if the trickle-down helps rebuild a community, helps rebuild a city, then you have to evaluate it on that basis. Now, a couple of things of concern that you can do is you have to answer the question in developing the plan, how do you give back to the community?
Right.
And no one out of the goodness of their heart is going to give back to the community. So you have to talk about, investment in corporate social responsibility, of investment in the schools, investment in opportunities for low-income people that reside in the district, a certain set-aside housing so where housing becomes affordable. But you can't build those things, in. That costs the developer some, but that cuts into the profit margin. So you can do that somewhat. The other thing you got to be clear about, which still has not been proven in this case, will the infrastructure contributions that the public makes be enough to drive bankers to say that there's a good market and make the loans that are needed to go forward. It has to pass a smell test of being economically viable, that there be a market demand for the project, because no opportunity zone is going to succeed, and this is where the public gets ripped off unless there's a viable market for what's being developed in the zone. So, it's on a case-by-case basis. I'm very excited about what I know about Pawtucket, and when I see a community, whether it's Pawtucket or some community elsewhere in the country, who's been declining and has had stagnation, for almost a century, and you can use an opportunity zone concept to revitalize, restore that community, it's a chance, worth taking. And I think safeguards can be built in.
We've written a number of stories about it, and I think everybody is excited about the idea of having, some new, fresh professional sports opportunities. Whether or not that's the right one, high enough level professionally that it's going to get people to come out and go see it. I don't know that that's been fully explored yet to date. $400 million of investment seems like a very, very significant amount of money for a group that has never done anything like this. Their project in Arizona is just a stadium, a pop-up stadium, not actually a permanent stadium. And the questions are mounting as to whether or not they have raised the capital. They've got the clock's on the field. They've got 120 days to prove due diligence to the state that they've got the resources and the wherewithal. Is this a swinging for a home run type of project rather than maybe a more phased in component? We've in my lifetime we've only had one project of this size, and that would be Providence Place Mall. That was 4 years in negotiations, and it included the most experienced mall developer team in the country, Pyramid's Dan Lugash, who initially started with Pyramid and then it morphed over to being Dan Lugash. And the other person behind it was a big player, both regionally and nationally, John Sasse, who had been top man to Governor Dukakis and helped run his presidential campaign. These were serious people with serious assets and opportunities to tap into major financial the two players from Arizona, I think that's yet to be proven.
Well, that's why you do the due diligence. But you ask the question, do you take a smaller bite at the apple or do you take a bigger bite? Well, it depends on the market.
Yeah.
In Providence, there was no retail in Providence. Westminster Street had gone from a mall to a street, back to a mall.
Right.
The department stores.
Woolworths had even closed. It was
Yeah.
all going downhill.
And so
Tom McCann was gone. Chess King, all the hot spots.
And there was a there was a market. There was very innovative financing, worked out with government on how the sales tax was handled to pay the debt of the mall. And so while it's not the scope of what's being discussed for Pawtucket, it met the needs of the market and it was a major scope. In Pawtucket, I think the pieces, I'm not a developer, so I don't know this for sure. If you just plopped a stadium down in the middle of Pawtucket, what would you have? And so I think in some cases you got to roll the dice. And what they're talking about here, think about this for a second, is 200 housing units. How much of those will be for affordable, housing? Because that helps Pawtucket a lot. The 200 square feet of commercial office space, that can, help the city. So I don't have any way to judge it right now. All I know is one thing, and this is why I want to see the due diligence go forward, and think in this case, because of a community, you can take a bigger bite at the apple. This place has been declining for 100 years.
Yeah.
Somebody's come along and said we can change it. It's a game changer. So give them every opportunity to do the due diligence, but always remember it's markets, markets, markets. If there's a market for it, the due diligence will work out. The people will lend the money. They'll be incentivized by getting a good, tax deal. And it's not state taxes; they're federal tax
Right.
incentives that have been given. And to me, that seems to be a pretty smart use of federalism. On the other hand, and this is what you always have to watch out for, as a conservative, it scares the hell out of me. Anytime government gets involved and makes deals with developers, there's too much back scratching sometimes that goes on. So the public needs to be aware. You have to have some faith in your elected leaders to make sure that it's structured in such a way that nothing is given until there's a performance in place. This seems to be the case with this project. In another 3 months, we'll know if it's real or not. And I think we got to be positive at this point, but also, realistic. 3 months from now, if it comes in and it adds up, great. If it doesn't add up, thanks for trying.
Do you think, I think it's 120 days, we're probably 10 days in. Do you think that's enough time for these guys? I mean, this is not a group that's self-funding, as I understand it, and I've spoken to Brett Johnson for some period of time. He's got to go out and raise the capital to be able to do it, to raise, on their side of the ledger, $300 million. Seems like for a group that doesn't have a track record in doing a scope of this in an opportunity zone, that seems like a short period of time to be able to get commitments of $300 million.
Yeah, it's not an over generous amount of time, but this kind of project, either it's going to be market viable or not. You may need to ask for an extension,
Yeah.
but you can't start out and say, we'll give you 6 months to do it, because then nothing, it just dissipates. Remember Bruce Sunderland used to say during the Cold War, if the Russians were in South Attleboro, you'd figure out how to move pretty quickly. And so this is an opportunity. I think if they come to the 120 days and they need another 10 or 20 or 30 days, that's different than saying they can't do it. But the market's going to answer this question very quickly.
Talk a little bit about, on the due diligence side, what's the must-answer questions that the state should be asking?
Well, the first must-answer question is economic viability. Is there an economic viable need for 200 square feet of commercial market space?
I met with Stephen Pryor last week. He felt comfortable that there's a demand on the commercial office space. He felt that the soccer stadium was viable. I wouldn't say he was overly enthusiastic about the retail component of it, other than adjoining maybe restaurants or beer halls, but that we can look across the street in almost any direction and see for rent, vacant, for lease, certainly in downtown Providence and in most every retail sphere across the region.
But that's what we're going to find out about economic viability. And the state is already on top of that. The second thing is, in structuring the deal, not a penny of public money until the private people meet a certain performance standard, and then public money can.
We've not always been good on that.
No?
We tore down a couple buildings down the block.
Yeah.
They were supposed to build a 40-story tower, I think around 2000 or so, and it never happened.
Yeah, and so the other thing I'd look very closely at is a lot of it's going to be funded with tax increment financing, and how good are those numbers? The legislation was passed last time, so every time these kinds of deals came up, it didn't have to come back to the legislature. There was
Right.
a source of funding. So I would look very closely and very coldly at what the tax increment financing will buy and what it won't buy. Because the worst thing that can happen is if you can give somebody tax increment financing, and instead of producing $1, produces 75 cents, then you really can't make the kinds of investments you need to have a viable project. But I think we got to be positive. I think what these people have come up with, without judging them, is something that could make a remarkable difference on the Blackstone Valley, make a remarkable difference for an urban area in the state that's been declining. And so I'm,
We got to do something.
I want to be positive. I want to be realistic. I don't want to wear some rose-colored glasses. But I think the things I mentioned to you, the things that keep your eye on.
Another deal that got approval from the state and got significant underwriting was the adjacent to the Wexford project. The same developer received somewhere around $6 or $7 million in rebuild money to build a hotel. And then it stagnated, didn't get developed simultaneously to the Wexford project, and now all of a sudden it's in an opportunity zone, not as it was initially forecasted to be. Is that sleight of hand? Is that
No, it's not a sleight of hand, because a year ago you couldn't predicted what the opportunity zones would be. So it's an opportunity that's come along. But this is a big difference between what's happening with Wexford and what's happening potentially in Pawtucket. If they couldn't get going on the hotel before they got a deal of deferring capital gains tax or getting capital gains tax waived, how has the market changed? What's happening in Wexford?
And here's the other question on the Wexford. We went and pulled that census tract. It's pretty hard to argue that that's a low-income area. The average home sells for, or condo sells for almost $400,000, twice the average price. The education level is 50% higher than the state's average.
So, and this is what kind of requires a kind of real politic. If government is going to be the agency that's defining opportunity zones, you can't take politics out of those decisions.
Mm-hmm.
You can manage politics in those decisions. You can hope you make the right decisions, and that's clearly a political judgment, a political decision. The hotel, but see, the question that keeps on coming back to my mind: if the hotel was a good investment, why wasn't it moving faster before the opportunity zones? Why all of a sudden, by giving a developer a chance to forego paying capital gains tax, does it become a viable economic project? See, with all the government money in the world, you can use it to incentivize, you can use it to give preferential treatment, but at the end of the day, the project has to be economically viable. And I'm not clear that the hotel is economically viable today because of the enterprise zones or the opportunity zones. We've got to stop calling them enterprise zones.
Yeah.
Opportunity zones than it was the day before they had opportunity zones. They couldn't get it going.
Some members of Congress, the Congressional Black Caucus on the House side, has been raising a lot of questions about it on the Senate side. Even Cory Booker, who was an advocate of this and part of the bipartisan effort to get this adopted, is raising questions about how these got selected and what the accountability is. Does this need to be revisited by Congress with better controls to make sure that just wealthy out-of-state investors aren't walking away with all the windfalls, and we're actually adopting policies to build less than viable projects because these guys can get an old school tax haven?
Of course it has to be audited, but you can't start auditing before you start doing it. You have to have something to audit. But yes, I think that would be important. I think the grand scale that it's on, having 8,700 plus opportunity zones throughout the country is a task by itself. But who thought for a minute that you can develop opportunity zones and some person that owned a restaurant or a gas station, or a hairdressing shop that was in the neighborhood was going to have the resources to rebuild that zone? It's going to take capital. It's going to take people that have access to capital to get this going. You have to build the safeguards in that they're proper set-asides and in developing the plans, they in fact do benefit people in the neighborhood. But I just find it totally naive to say, well, these are for low-income people and they had to be self-started by government and low-income people. Well, there's not enough resources in the world to have them self-started by low-income people. And then if government's the other self-starter, then we know enough about just, government.
But they certainly were sold as beneficial to low-income areas. Now it seems to be that some of the areas are low-income, some of the areas aren't. The early analysis of the projects that are moving forward seems to be tilted that, the same winners are winning again.
Well,
and I don't want to be Bernie Sanders on this, but, Under Armour, the richest guy, CEO, is getting one, and the governor of West Virginia, the richest man in the state.
And I don't like that.
And there's probably one down in East Greenwich for Gary Sasse, the money man. Maybe your strong endorsement of this. We'll have to wait and see.
But that's why the audit's so important. If it's to help the community, and the Pawtucket thing goes ahead in a modified fashion, then you have some questions that need to be built into the project. How much of the housing units are set aside as affordable units?
Mm-hmm.
How many people from who are getting better jobs as a result? 44% of the jobs that we create in Rhode Island are in industries that are low-wage industries.
Right.
So are we going to create?
I think Brookings had that number that 44% of the people are working in jobs nationally that are functionally low income.
Okay, so when you look at what happens in Pawtucket Enterprise Zone, jobs being created, not just people in this zone, but people with a big circle in the zone that had less opportunity. Is there more affordable housing? And in fact, do the people who live in the area benefit? If the people that live in the area benefit, then it has helped low-income people. It's also helped very wealthy people because they're taking advantage of tax loopholes that most people can't take advantage of, and that's their price to play the game. So it's a project-by-project basis. Some will do good. I'm afraid that around the country you're going to find political interference and there'll be questions. So you're right, they need to be audited. State role is very important because the federal government it really has limited capacity to get into each of the 50 states and give you a good assessment of what's on the ground in those places. So it depends upon what our state does. Does our state have the organizational infrastructure to effectively manage these kinds of projects?
It's big projects.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit. I want to go to D.C. for a minute. I don't want to get bogged down on the impeachment per se. The narrative that's going on in the Democratic primary on economic issues, where do you think the Democrats are? Do you think they're connecting with Americans? Do you think they're creating a stronger relationship with voting base across the country? Or, some have critiqued that, and even the former President Obama made a comment, I think 2 weeks ago, warning primary candidates not to go pivot too far left because they won't be able to come back to the center.
Well, it's a state of flux. And what you're seeing are really two, getting into different candidacies. You're seeing the extreme left, and we know that's Bernie and Elizabeth Warren. You're seeing Buttigieg pivot back to the middle. I don't know where he is, in the middle or the left, but now he's in the middle.
Yeah.
But you've also had Amy Klobuchar. You've had Senator Vice President Biden, who, even though he's making mistakes in the campaign, his popularity is staying relatively even. You had Mike Bloomberg getting in, and I wouldn't discount that yet.
Are you on the Bloomberg payroll? Because I'm hearing most everyone is.
Well,
or do you guys just have polo ponies together and that sort of thing?
We're kind of naive. We're working for something called common good capitalism, which will take some more time. I'll explain that to you. But So I think that it's a party that's really going through some soul searching. I see a subtle shift within the party. You're back to the middle. I think you go out, and I've been around in some states where there are Democrat primaries, and people will say, I don't want this pie in the sky stuff. I'll give you an example: Medicare for all. Well, if you talk about health care for all, and you have a mixed way of getting to health care for all, people buy that in a minute. They don't believe Medicare for all. And the biggest word that's causing these people problems and they're being ridiculed for, that's why they moved back to the center, is a four-letter word. It's free. Free school, free health, free everything.
Now, let's say we come out of Iowa, which is now, about 75 days away, and two of the top three are Senator Warren and Senator Sanders. Will we see the party pivot back to the left?
No, I think there's a split in the party. I don't know how it's going to work its way out. I think you could get to a broker convention. There are a lot of people still involved. But keep in mind there are 5 steps. There's Iowa,
Yeah.
New Hampshire, South Carolina, Nevada, and then Super Tuesday. So Bloomberg could be laying back in the shrubs. And
That's never worked, though. That's never in the history of electoral politics.
No one's had this much money before to put into it. It didn't work with Giuliani, but his strategy was a little bit different. He was going to stay in the background until Florida, and he got beaten in Florida, and the whole ball game was over.
Yeah.
It's so tough to know. But I do sense within the leadership of the party certain concern, and they about whether they can beat Trump. And the issue they have to deal with is not all this pie in the sky stuff. Is what gives them the best chance of winning the election, because this is a pivotal election. I don't know if this country can stand 4 more years of President Trump, and so the party has to figure out.
But the one truism that has been dominant in every election, certainly of my lifetime at the national level, is at the end of the day, when they go in to pull the lever, they vote on dollars and cents. And Friday's jobs number, 266,000 additional jobs, the lowest unemployment in 50 years. The president ought to just be quiet, go to Camp David, cut the Twitter line, and simply talk about that.
And that's why the impeachment thing's important. Even though the obvious money is he'll get impeached in this House and he will not be convicted in the Senate. If you can pick up 3 or 4 Republicans, which is very possible, and you have a majority, voting to convict on the impeachment, not a majority to impeach him. If you have things like happened today, where the independent inspector comes out and says there wasn't collusion in what the FBI did in their investigation of Russia, and then the Attorney General says yes there was, and this is the group that works for him. I mean, you have.
Do you think, though, you see the polling data coming out? There's more polling data. The Ukraine and the issues tied to the Ukraine are about 27th on the average American's.
But what's on the average American's list? I can't.
Is jobs, education, the economy.
Jobs and health are the 2
healthcare.
Biggest issues, and Trump has actually no program on healthcare, 0 program on healthcare. But there's something else out there right now. It's a question of trust, and then so even though people don't relate to Ukraine or don't relate to some of the things that don't affect their daily life. Just the constant.
And you are on the public record of calling for the president's impeachment. You made it here about 6-8 weeks ago.
And I think all the information that's come out since has justified my position. I think the House will impeach him. It's too bad it's going to be on a partisan vote.
Will they pick up any Republicans? I think they only have 1 Republican in the House.
No, I think they'll lose some Democrats in the House. But I don't think they will. I think that.
Do you think the Democrats have done a good job? I listened to House Judiciary this morning for about the first hour. Forget the issues. I just thought how they handled it was less than compelling in a digital age. In a period of time, especially even more so, when we think back to Watergate, we remember the highlights, right? John Dean or Butterfield or things like that stood out and changed history. So there was mundane. Today was mundane. It was the first day of functionally questions and answers, and it just seemed to bog down almost instantaneously.
Yeah, that was a tough hearing, today.
And
It's a-
Nadler's under criticism, that he's not the chairman for the job. This is no Sam Mead
Oh, Peter Rodino.
or Peter Rodino. And Peter Rodino
Who's
was a
great.
partisan Democrat, but I think people trusted him and found him compelling.
Well, it's not just Nadler, who I think is, less than best for that job, but
Sam Ervin, excuse me.
yeah, but it's Howard Baker,
Yeah.
who's one of our guys. But there's such a wall of working together, such distrust that everything is viewed as tribal. In 1908 Nixon was 74. There was partisanship, but it was much less, less.
But I'm just talking competency, command, control.
Yeah, well, Schiff did a good job, I thought. I thought she did a very good job at the Intelligence Committee. Now he's dealing with no one's vote's going to change in that committee. And they have to establish a record, and sometimes the record gets pretty dry. But I would agree with you with this one thing. When they do vote to impeach the president, there has to be a tagline.
Mm-hmm.
In Nixon, it was Watergate, it's break-in,
Right.
break-in, he was breaking it. In the case of Andrew Johnson 100 years before, it was civil rights.
Mm-hmm.
In the case of
Bill Clinton.
Bill Clinton, it was
A blue dress.
moral.
It was lying.
It was lying.
Simply
right.
lying to
Okay, so this is what they have to
Right.
do. They have to figure out what the tagline is, and that's the public relations part. I wouldn't get too lost in these hearings because people at work, they're not listening to
Yeah.
the hearings, but they do have to. It has to be packaged, certainly.
The Money Man, thank you. Glad you're
Pleasure.
back. We'll be back next week, I hope. And let's dig into the state's economy and the state's budget.
Sounds good.
Thanks, everybody, for tuning in today. Stay tuned. There is a lot of news breaking today. I think we've got 2 or 3 e-blasts already out. And sadly, this last 24 hours or so has just been a series of very prominent people passing away, Paul Volcker being one of them, who was about 6'10" back in the day. We sent a photographer over the other night when the head of the Fed was in town, Powell, and one of the considerations for journalists and the photographers was the Secret Service. I don't remember Paul Volcker having Secret Service. He was 6'10". I don't think he needed it, but we'll check into that one with the Fed. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow. It will be Kate Nagel. Thanks, and have a great, safe night on the drive home in the rain. Thank you.